Hello to everyone who is joining us for our 9th webinar. Can't believe we made it this far. We made it to number 9, Intro to Settlement. We're going to be discussing types of settlements, where do you go for this information, the intricacies with getting the numbers right, and what these type of sheets look like, to cash orders, to managing your cash, expenses, stagehands, you name it, the full spectrum of what goes into settlement. And yeah, so we've got some special guest panelists with us today, and we've got our returning cast panelists that are with us as well. And yeah, so we're going to kick things off. I'm going to pass it to Henry, and we'll get things rolling.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, today we're going to cover the art form of the deal. A settlement is the process of getting paid in show business, and it's usually the tour manager's job to reconcile that transaction. It's imperative a TM can recognize numerical errors and foul play so they can end the night with a handshake instead of a fist. Today, with the help of our distinguished tour accountants, Morgan Dentch with Harry Styles, Eli Akins with Zach Brown Band, and Jordan Yousem with AEG, we're going to pull back the curtain on settlement and teach you a thing or two to help you close out your show. Thanks for joining us, guys. Hey. All right, let's jump into it. Jordan, you come from the promoter side of the show. First, for our new students, can you describe what your job is and the things you deal with on a daily basis?
Absolutely. The main focus of my job is to increase revenue for everyone. That's what we're all here for. And secondly would be to ensure a great day for our clients, our artists, everyone involved. I handle pretty much everything from the downstage edge into the house. So if it's production related, I don't deal with it. That's what our touring production managers do. But I deal with all the accounting, the numbers, the ticketing from the promoter side of things, and act as an intermediary usually between the venue and the artist.
Right. Now, in touring, there's a lot of different types of deals, a lot of different types of settlements. Can you tell us about the different types of settlements we see out there and how do we approach them differently?
Absolutely. There are a few different types of deals. The first one would be a door deal, which is where you basically get paid based upon how many people you bring in through the door. It's pretty simple. It's the most basic form of getting paid as an artist. The next one would be a flat guarantee, where the promoter or venue guarantees you X number of dollars, and it doesn't matter what the expenses are. It doesn't matter if one person shows up or 1 million people show up. The next type of deal would be a versus deal, which is a little bit more complicated, but it is usually a guarantee versus the net show receipts less expenses on a show. And you usually get the greater of those two. So it is in everyone's advantage to try and maximize revenue, reduce expenses so that everyone makes the most amount of money in that type of deal. The last type of deal would be like a festival deal, but that's usually just a flat guarantee.
Yeah, with festivals, you know, as a tour manager, you know, it's getting more common that I see obviously on festivals and maybe with DJ acts that there is no settlement really. It's always just handled by the wire between the promoter to the agent or your business management. And, you know, I still like to do my due diligence and make sure that everybody has the information they need. But a lot of the times there is no settlement. So today's session is going to focus on the types of shows that actually have a full settlement and require you to know your numbers and reconcile. MJ, you want to take it off from here?
Yeah. So settlement sheets. The settlement sheet is a detailed form that lists all the revenue and expenses, and it calculates the band's earnings based on the deal that was in the contract for that show. That's the simplest way I know how to put it. You will find the deal in your deal memo, which we've spoken about before. And the promoter may come to settlement with their own sheet. But I think all of us here, when we were speaking yesterday, agree that that entering all the show data on your own sheet helps you do your due diligence with the numbers And often you can even catch a mistake on the promoter side. I mean, just, you know, honest mistakes. They've entered a number wrong. They've put a decimal point someplace wrong, and that can change everything. So it's kind of checks and balances. And I think we all feel pretty strongly it's good just to have your own sheet and sit with the promoter and enter everything. So we'll look at a settlement sheet just designed for a club show, very basic. Let me share this with you. There are many kinds of settlement sheets. There's no cookie cutter. Everybody has their sheet they prefer. We all share sheets, and but for the purposes of this, I'm just going to do a simple club settlement, and this is for a versus deal, which I think you probably will see mostly in clubs. Here we go. You guys got that? There we go. Okay. So this particular sheet just starts with your artist name, settlement, the basics. You'd enter city, state, venue, capacity, your deal. This deal is guarantee. It's 32,500 versus 90% of the net. So it's just a summary of everything. The next portion down is our revenue. So we've got ticket sales, different ticket types, price of each, the amount sold. Now, as you get to larger shows, this portion of settlement is going to become more intricate with different levels of tickets. You'll do things like starting inventory of ticket types. But for 101 purposes, we're just looking at ticket prices and the amount of tickets sold. Then we have this is our gross ticket sales. We have various deductions. This particular show had $1 charity per ticket deducted, a facility fee. They didn't actually have a facility fee, and tax. Now, the order of how these are deducted is very specific to the show. Again, there's no one size fits all. This particular show had to be deducted in a certain order because of the state it took place in, just the way things needed to be taxed in the order. So this is something, usually I'll talk with the promoter and discuss, you know, it's something you'll discuss in advance, sometimes on the day of, especially at club level, just how that works.
Hey, MJ, I want to jump in for a second and do some one-on-one vocabulary. Can you define drop count for me?
Yeah, drop count would be, so you have your amount of tickets sold. There was 1,280 tickets sold. There were 40 comps, which don't actually factor in, obviously, because they're zero to the gross. The drop count is what actually came through the door. So the reason we call it drop count is because there used to be this thing called hard tickets that they would rip and drop into a box, and then somebody would count them to see how many people actually came through the door. Now we call it a scan count, but this has a bearing on your variable expenses. So, for example, I'm not going to go too deep into this because Jordan's going to go more in depth on expenses later. But your drop count could inform your insurance rate. So if your insurance is 59 cents per head, you want to pay on the amount of people that are actually in the door that you need to insure. That's very simplified explanation, but that's what a drop count is.
And you may think that 100% of people who buy tickets turn up to shows, but that's never the case. There's always a certain percentage of drop count. But for example, the last show I did before our great shutdown was at the Roundhouse in London, which is a 3,000 capacity venue. And we had, because of the fears of the virus, we had 56% of our drop count percentage was 56%. So only 56% of people who bought tickets in a 3,000 capacity venue turned up for that show. So that's nearly half people didn't turn up. So, you know, it varies quite wildly depending.
And there's always an attrition rate for a show, like always. There's always people that don't show up. Some of it is because there were comps given out. You know, there's always people that don't show up.
Mm-hmm.
I think the number is like a standard 10%.
I think so.
I believe that we use a basic 10% no-show rate. Morgan, am I right? Yeah, it's 10%. 10% of your ticket buyers generally are not showing.
Yeah, and there's a few reasons also why it's important. And I did a show where we had a lot of the tickets are going to secondary ticketing, to scalpers, if you will. And so we had a lot of people not showing up because those tickets were bought by scalpers but not sold. So there's a lot of information you can get just from that figure alone.
Yeah. And then we have expenses. I'm not going to go too deep into these because Jordan's going to go over in more in depth different types of expenses in a little bit. But we have fixed costs, which are basically the costs that you agree upon in advance with the promoter. They're not going to really change. Support, advertising, and when I say change, I don't mean that like it's going to change from budget to actual. It's just not it's just not a cost that changes depending on the number of attendees or some other variables. So medical, there's always a line item for miscellaneous, which is anything you don't really know that doesn't fall under anything. I've just put in here just that these are just like the basic expenses you'll usually see, but everybody customizes their sheet to specific expenses that are applicable to that show or that tour. And then we have variable expenses. Again, these are expenses that change depending on the number of attendees. Usually it's to do with number of attendees, but could be other factors. So here we have, per head rate on insurance.
Is this the remix?
You guys getting an endless feedback loop?
If you're streaming it multiple sources, try lowering one down. It glitches out when there's audio streams.
I'm not actually. That's really strange. I have nothing else on. Okay. So hopefully that worked. We have venue rental. This one was 5% of the gross. I just put it in there. A lot of, in clubs, you're probably not going to see a venue rental. And if you do, because the promoter was renting the club out, they're not an independent promoter. It's usually a flat. Licenses, we've ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, and GMR. If you are in Europe, you'll have the PRS. There's different licensing. These, when I was first starting, these were just, I could not wrap my head around them because there's all sorts of different levels, percentages and stuff. But it's based on, some of them are based on capacity of the venue. Some of them are based on how many people are in the door. This particular sheet just calculates up to venues for 5,000, but there are cheat sheets. So, and sometimes when I was just starting, I was just usually relying on the promoter to give me the number and trusting that it was right. But it is really interesting to wrap your head around, what these are and get a sheet for that. And then this has a percentage of 3% on credit card sales of commission. I just put here that you would get the credit card sales from the ticket audit. At 101 level in a club, that's where you're probably getting the information from. It gets a little more complicated as you do larger settlements, but for this. And then we have our settlement formulas, subtotal of expenses, our net ticket sales, and the split point, which is, I'm going to really simplify it, but it's basically the net ticket sales minus the expenses. So 90% of, basically 90% of our net ticket sales minus the expenses is 21,000. That is smaller than the guarantee, so we take the guarantee. If it was higher, if that number was higher than the guarantee, we would take the larger number. That's what a versus deal is. So it's whichever higher. This tour, the artist was acting as the vendor for some sort of production, probably sound or lights. So they're getting $1,000 payment from the promoter. So this is the total earnings. There was a $10,000 deposit made. The tour manager picked up 5,000 in cash. So the balance due is 18,500. And there's a few other calculations down here that I just like to see. It says what the walkout percentage was to the artist, how much the promoter made. So at the end of the night, typically you would print this as a PDF or maybe the next morning and send this to the agent, the business manager, the manager, anybody who just wants to see that and see all that information. So it's just the calculating that and sending all the information in. The other thing that you should make sure you have with your settlement sheet when you go to settlement is you're going to want to make sure you have a PDF of the band's W-9 to send to the promoter, because they need that to pay you. And just really briefly, I want to show another settlement sheet just to show you that there's no real cookie cutter for this. And this is, you know, this really just shows the same stuff, but just a little more in detail. So this is also a versus deal. Got the same information at the top, a little more detail on the ticket types that can be entered, more of a breakdown of expenses. As your shows get bigger and bigger, you're gonna wanna do more of a breakdown of the line items. And variable costs, a lot more of those. But it basically does the same thing. I like to say that, you know, as shows get bigger, it's all the same. There's just more zeros and more and more rows on your settlement sheet.
I think looking at a settlement for the first time, looking at those settlement sheets can be quite a daunting process. So I think it's worth just to say that a versus deal is there almost as an incentive for the artist to sell out the show. So in very basic terms, a guarantee is a guaranteed fee that you will earn like Henry said in the intro. A versus deal is there as an encouragement for the artist to help sell the show out. So for example, in a very basic term, if you're on your first tour, say you're earning $1,000 guarantee in Boston at a 300 cap room, just pulling figures out in my head here, your walkout potential from selling that show out might be $3,000. So it's important for you as a tour manager to keep a handle on the expenses that MJ just showed you in the settlement there, because ultimately everything that goes over budget, all of those expenses are taken out of the gross potential that you walk out of a show with. So, you know, it can be daunting looking at a settlement for the first time, but what you really need to know is the value that you can gain for your artist by managing the expenses and keeping on top of things, because it will ultimately affect your walkout potential and what they earn, the artist's potential to earn from a show is. So in really simple terms, that's what you're looking at here. You want to keep a handle on all those expenses so your artist walks out with the most amount of money based on the amount of tickets that they've sold.
That's true, Doug. So how do I keep handle of those expenses? Like, Morgan, where do I go to find the information I need to make sure all of those line items are correct? Like as a promoter, you're putting in those numbers. Where can I go? What do I expect to see as a tour manager to make sure that these numbers are right?
Sure. So I was saying this earlier to you guys the other day, but when I first started my touring before rock and roll, I started out on Sesame Street Live. That was my first show, was with Elmo and Big Bird. And so everything I learned on settlements, I actually learned on Sesame Street, learned how to count. But when I remember sitting through my first settlement, and I remember sitting in the back of the room thinking, like, this is magic. This is alchemy. How are these guys figuring this out? But it isn't magic and alchemy. It's the most important thing with successful settlements is information and preparation. In order to get the information, there's a few different places you can go. First place I would say is artist management and business management for the artist. First of all, just the logistics, like you were saying earlier, of getting the paperwork that you need, the bank details that you need, sort of what information do they need back, and how do they want to see it presented. Some managements will have a format that they like or don't like, things like that. But I also think it's really important. I always have a conversation with a new tour, and I always ask what approach they want. I've had some tours that say, fight for every penny, don't leave a cent on the table, leave them bleeding. That's what we want. I've had some management who say, we just want to be fair. We just want to do, we want to get what's ours, but we want to be fair. And then I've had some, there may be more going on that you know about. I've had some management who say, this show specifically, we're not taking the best deal we could, but we're looking to book a whole next year with this promoter or this venue or this country. So there might be more at work than you realize about this specific show. So I always like to kind of get a bit of the history and a bit of the backstory before everyone, because you never know, there might be more than you're aware of. The next major place you're going to is usually the booking agent. And I don't know if I think you guys have discussed this quickly before, but the booking agent is the person who throws the darts at the map. They do the routing for the tour. They are the main person who's going to speak with the promoters in advance and set up the deal itself. Once they do set up the deal with the promoter, they come up with what is usually referred to as the deal memo. And that's where most of the information that you're going to need is based. There will be a contract, which is hopefully exactly the same as the deal memo, but with more contract wording. But usually you start with the deal memo. There's lots of useful information in the deal memo: contacts, venue, location, curfew, capacities, ticket prices are usually in there as well. The deal itself, obviously, if it's a guarantee, if it's a flat, what the percentages are. And then the expenses. These expenses have usually been discussed with the promoter between the promoter and management or booking agents in advance. And the promoter will usually submit what they expect the shows to cost. And these expenses then get basically approved, and then they're usually referred to as show expenses or show costs. And that's when we go back to talk about expenses, how do you know what expenses are essentially allowed and not? This is your main point to go back to where these show costs come from. It's really helpful to go through these, and you'll notice if you look at, like, if you have 10 dates in a row, for example, you might look at catering, and maybe catering is 4,000 for most dates, but then in one place catering suddenly jumps up to be 7,000. That's a helpful thing to compare and to take a look at and to flag why something might be different or something might be out of the normal. And again, maybe there's a reason for it, or maybe there's not. And then there's also other helpful things in there, such as in the deal memos, such as taxes, fees, also other points worth mentioning. How many comps go to the artist, how many comps go to the promoter is something that's usually in there. So that can be really helpful. And I make a point of having a good relationship with my booking agent. I like to be able to go to them with questions. This kind of goes back to the preparation. So once I get those deal memos, I go through them, and if anything does look strange, or if I don't understand anything, or if something is in there that seems weird, I like to be able to go back to my booking agent and say, why did we say that we would pay for this? Or why is this in there? And often there's a reason, and sometimes there's not. So it's good to have that relationship. And this goes into the preparation and doing it in advance, because booking agents don't want to get that call at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. So it's good to ask that ahead of time. Booking agents will also keep track of the deposits paid. So that's also really important to have as well. And they're a really helpful resource with taxes. I think we might mention it a bit later, but if you don't know how the taxes work in all of these different states or countries, booking agents can be a really helpful resource with that as well. Another place to go for information is experience, whether it's your experience, the band's experience, friends' experience. I usually will go through, and I almost always refer to the last time if I played a venue. If I played the same venue a year ago, 2 years ago, I almost always look at my settlement last time to see, has catering gone up way high? Have stagehands gone higher? Is rent different? Even if it's with a different band, or if you haven't played these places before, it's good to ask management, because perhaps the band has played the same cities year after year. So they might have previous settlements you can look at and things you can get as well. So there is a lot of information out there. You just kind of have to know where to look for it. But again, information and preparation, I think, are the key points there.
No, thank you so much. That's all of that information is amazing. Very well put on where we go to get it. But I remember when I was starting out that it really was a daunting process. That was it was tough to get through. It took me a little longer sometimes with how complicated some ticketing items can be. But I found that the more I advanced it and the more I got ahead of it, the easier the settlement really was in the end for me. So when it comes to advancing settlement, Eli, tell me what's the best practice to go about advancing a settlement?
I think advancing the settlements are about who, what, when, where, and why. You want to know who you're settling with first and foremost, and create some rapport with that person in an advance sheet ahead of time to know. It's all about knowing what to expect and who to expect it from. A lot of times in these venues, you'll go year after year, every couple of years, and it's the same person over and over and over again, the lifers, if you will. And sometimes you go into somebody new, so you want to get out in front of it. If it has changed, or if it is a new person, you want to know who that person is and where to go. You want to establish that rapport with that person up front, like you say, so you can leave with a handshake instead of a fist fight. Very important stuff. I think in the advance, you need to get your deal memo from your booking agent and know it and learn it and compare it to years past or to other venues that are of similar size. And get out front with your agent on questions that you have, like Morgan said, if things have changed greatly. Sometimes the agents, I've found, look at the bigger picture and they look at the bigger numbers and they accept things from years past. What if your tour has added trucks or added something else that's going to affect your labor bill? That's something you can help point out with your booking agent or learn from your booking agent about those kind of things to get a better feel on what the number is going to be at the end of the night. And just about avoiding surprises at the end of the night. Ask questions up front, get with the person you're going to settle with. Definitely ask for a pre-settlement at least a week or two out in advance with a corresponding audit, so you know where things are coming in, where things are not coming in.
Let's do some 101 vocabulary right there.
Sure.
Audit. What's an audit?
Is basically a ticket manifest that shows all of your capacities, the pricing, where tickets fall in certain categories as like comps or special services like VIP or platinum. And those can be daunting too. I remember the first ones I had, I was using a piece of paper to run it down all of the columns because they're just confusing, but it becomes second nature at some point, and then they change everything again and add all these dynamics, and then you have to learn it all over again. So ticket audit is your friend on a good day and your enemy on a bad day. But
yeah,
it's the way to know what's happening with the box office.
Yeah, that's one of the first things I tend to ask for now in the mornings. Give me water, towels, and a fresh audit.
And all through the day. I ask for one at 10 a.m., noon, 3, 6, 8, and close. I want them all through the day. I want to keep up with the wrap on the day. People think that's people say it's overkill, but that's what I want, and that's what I get. So,
right. And there are different types of audits too. Like I have my preferred type I like to look at. Like my favorite is the qual for,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like
in this day and age, you need three to make it work with all the dynamic pricing. You need a regular audit, you need a qual audit, you need, it's just you need an Arctics, you need a host, you need all kinds of things to get it all circled in.
Right. And also part of advancing your settlement is going to be asking for those things up front and talking about the timing of when in the day you want to settle. Eli, Can you talk a little bit about what happens when you get jammed up at the end of the night?
Yeah, you get the oil spot. The bus leaves and you walk out, there's nothing there. That's what happens.
It's important
not
because
often, but
you might need to be getting settled while your artist is on stage, so that when your artist is off stage, you can resume your duties as a tour manager and get on down the road, which is why it's so important to do so much homework in advance. Get your numbers together, start fighting about things earlier in the day instead of at 9 p.m. when you're walking the artist on stage potentially. And now it's a surprise party and everybody's jammed up and tense because in addition to having a potential discrepancy, you now have a time issue on your hands. And that gets everybody crazy, especially if you're wearing a couple of hats.
If you have your pre-settlement a week out, then you're asking questions even further in advance. And then you can schedule a time during the day, say 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, to go over the pre-settlement. That gets you even closer to being locked in to getting out on time or whenever you need to get out or want to get out. I think another thing is just to never be afraid to ask questions. There's no stupid questions, only stupid people, I guess. But you could always ask questions, and it seems like the music business is still sort of the wild, wild west, if you will, and things are negotiable almost up until the very bitter end. So don't be afraid to ask questions. It lets people know you're paying attention. It lets people know you're on your game. So it's important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything's negotiable. I like that one. That's a good one to take away.
Right.
You know, these ultimately the promoter is there for your best interests and wants you to do well. Everybody wants to make money in the end, but everything's negotiable.
Yeah, and I also feel like it's important to mention, and we've hit this before, but when we were doing advancing and we talked about day of show and loading in and what have you, this is the place where it's really important to remind everyone that you're in a partnership on a show day with your promoter and your
on the best
artist.
days, yes.
It's a partnership. So
yep.
You want to approach it in that manner. And if it gets tense or you have a question that you feel like may be a little bit contentious, do your best to try and say, hey, I just wanted to ask a quick question about this just for my own knowledge, just to make sure that so on and so forth. Ask the questions and have
that's
that
with your settlement contact and the box office. Don't be afraid to march up to the box office and get clarification on anything that you need. It's very important. You know, don't leave asking yourself the question why. Ask the promoter of the box office the question why.
Right.
And you typically, if you can get the answer to that, if you have an argument, you can win it.
And so as we go down the Jordan, as we go down our settlements and we're looking at expenses, talk to me about, because as the promoter side, you're collecting a lot of these receipts and figures that I'm going to have a lot of questions from. So walk me down the everything from stagehand invoices, to catering, and then let's talk about house nuts.
Okay, absolutely. In no particular order, you have your advertising. A couple of points to keep in mind. If your show sold out months ago and you're still paying for advertising, there's potentially an issue at that point. Vice versa, if your show hasn't sold out, why did you stop advertising? Those are all good questions to ask your promoter or venue, whoever your partner is on the show. You then have rent and staffing. Rent is the cost to go into a building. Staffing would be the cost to operate the building. So that would include things like security, ushers, ticket takers, janitors. And then you have an option of a house nut, which is one number to cover the rental and the opening and operating of the building. The house nut would usually cover security, catering, stagehands, and all those house nut numbers come with a little asterisk that they are limited at a certain point. They will say, well, our house nut includes 3 stagehands for 4 hours. If you come in with a ton of production, and hopefully you've advanced this all, they're going to say, well, you want to know something? You're going to need more stagehands than that are going to be in excess of the house nut. Those are all things to take into account during your advance and also during your settlement to be cognizant of. MJ touched on variable expenses, so I won't get into those. Stagehands, those can vary wildly both in costs and in crew numbers. In a small club, you might just have a couple of guys or gals that are going to set up your show. In an arena, you can have anywhere from 75 to 150 stagehands that are required to build your show, to build out the production, to rig everything. It's in instances like that where you have large numbers that a house nut wouldn't cover those extreme numbers, just because every production is totally different in what their requirements are. You have catering. In a smaller venue, or in the smallest of venues, you'll have a buyout where they don't have catering facilities. So they'll literally give you money for you to go down to McDonald's or Subway and to get your own lunch. Larger venues may have catering facilities there where they'll say we have a cold breakfast and a cold lunch and a hot dinner. And then when you get up into an arena, you have full-blown catering where you may even have an 18-wheeler that functions as a mobile kitchen, and you're providing meals for the venue staff that can't leave during the day, for all of your traveling party, for stagehands. So you may be feeding upwards of 125, 150 people per meal. And then all these things come into play based upon the type of deal that we're talking about. So if you have a versus deal, which is going to be your most common type of deal, these are what are called show costs, and they're all used to calculate the net that is taken against your guarantee. So it's really important to keep an eye on these costs because ultimately they're going to affect your bottom line as the artist. And it doesn't do any good to go to your venue rep or your promoter rep at the end of the day and say, wow, our catering was really expensive. And they're going to say, well, yeah, you requested, 150 meals and that's what we provided. If you advance properly and say, oh, you want something that's an old rider, we only need 100 meals, you're going to save yourself the cost of 50 meals. So advancing is probably the most important thing you can do to manage your expenses, because with stagehands, for example, or with catering, for example, you usually have 24 or 48 hours to make any changes. So if you show up and go, oh, we didn't need all those stagehands, well, they're already there, they're getting paid, you're paying them. That was lack of preparation on usually the tour's part for not communicating. If you did communicate it, make sure you have everything in writing as a good word of advice, because if you did tell the venue or the promoter, hey, I don't need that, but they didn't follow through on it, if you don't have it in writing, it's going to be a hard argument to win.
So if you've been watching our episodes, and then you may start seeing now how important everything we talked about from episodes 1 through 8 is leading up to all to this settlement, right? It's everything you've done is going to affect this bottom line, every decision you've made. So, Morgan, beyond the fixed costs in this, let's talk about stuff that is a variable, like comps, and what are some other expenses that we need to watch that are leading up to the show day?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of things aside from just stagehands and catering and the actual expenses that are important to look out for. Comps are a really big one. If you're selling really well, every comp issued is money lost, if you will. So whether it's the artist putting all his friends in, or if it's the promoter taking more comps than expected, things like that. But it's really important to watch those figures because every ticket given away for free is money given away. There's a bunch of other ways to sort of look at whether it's expenses or extra money coming in. VIP ticket revenue is really important. Premium ticketing or platinum ticketing is really important these days. Merch, there's obviously digital streams or live streams of the show. There's various different ways now that's really important to look at other money coming in. And then there's things like penalties that are really important to look at. Curfew is a big one. If you break curfew in a lot of places, the venues have very specific fees if you play past a certain point. So that can be, or festivals, so it can be really important to be aware of that. Stagehand penalties can add up really fast. That's if you don't give them an hour to walk away for lunch, or in some cases you need to let the stage go, or dark stage, if you will, where everybody clears the stage for usually an hour for dinner or half hour, depending on the venue. And if you break that, if one of your guys goes on stage and starts working, that can cause a lot of trouble, and you can end up with a very large penalty. Another place is filming. I think we mentioned this real quickly. Filming or recording the show or streaming the show. In some cases, even putting it on social media is becoming a bit of an issue. There's a lot of venues or even stagehands or unions that require extra fees if you're going to record the show and sell it as a broadcast later on. So there's a lot of different areas like that that's really important to be aware of. And then just in general, as we were saying with the advance, I think it's important when you do the advance with your promoter to just ask questions of, hey, if I say that I need this, is there an extra cost? Because some things there aren't and some things there are, and sometimes you may not be aware of what you're asking for is going to cost you more money in the long run. And then another thing just to mention is that there's nothing standard from one band to another. So just because you're with one band and you needed 4 runners to get through the day, your next band maybe doesn't need that at all. I think there's a big differentiation between spending money and wasting money. And if you're what's really important to a band, I mean, some bands have got to have their steak dinner at 5 p.m. and that is just something that needs to happen for the show to happen. And other bands don't care about food as long as there's booze. So it depends on what's important to the band. It depends on what's important to the tour. And I think it's important to take a look at everything, whether it's catering, whether it's how many stagehands you have, whether it's how many, you know, whatever equipment you have or what you have. I think it's important to look at it individually and say, do we actually need this, or is this something that we're ordering just because? So I think it's an important thing to look at, to be able to rein in expenses that way.
Yep. Another note on comps for tours that I've done is that you establish a number for the promoter, a number for the artist, and anything over is paid for. And I've established a clause in ours that the promoter is not allowed to give their comps to their vested interests, the people, the local sponsors that are hanging their signs or providing some service to them that's monetized, that we see no part of. I don't allow that in my comp reports. That's money that I save almost every day.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And also with comps, because like Morgan was saying about being responsible and seeing where you can save money, it's important to note that if your show is doing well and say you have maybe 30 comps and you're only going to use 10, you can put those other 20 back out on sale, depending on the deal. There's some variances there, but usually I can give those tickets back to the promoter, and they can put them back on sale, and you can make more money for your band that night just by releasing your comps. That's probably the second biggest question I get all the time, other than, is your guest list ready? It's, are you going to use all your comps tonight?
Yeah,
right?
Well,
it's important to be aware of what your tickets sales look like, because you can plan that even days ahead of time. Throughout the leading up to it. If you can get ahead of that and sell those, that's money in your pocket, and that's super valuable.
Absolutely.
Well, it's also it's always better to make money than cut expenses. So everyone wins when we make money, and versus having to fight over expenses. So I think that's always helpful.
It's also important to know that what your ticket audit looks like before you return those tickets back, to make sure they go back into inventory.
Yeah. And I think there's a question here from Ken Deans. Hi, Ken. That I think is pertinent right now. And he asks, can someone talk about off audit tickets, i.e. like suites? And actually I've run across this even in a theater, you know, where there was an area that was sold off audit for VIP subscriptions.
Good question.
It ended up being a very fun settlement.
I can talk about this a little bit. So there's a reason why we call it a ticket manifest, the ticket audit, because it's not necessarily every seat in the house or standing if it's GA. And I think this goes back to sort of the booking agent and the deal that's arranged originally, is because the promoter and the booking agent come to a deal that says, in this venue, 5,000 tickets will be available. That doesn't mean there's only 5,000 seats. There might be suites or club seats or boxes or whatever they call them. Even sometimes it's just seats that look just like normal seats, but these 2 rows just don't go into the manifest. And that's unfortunately just part of the world. I mean, especially arenas are terrible for this these days. But it's how the venues make their money. It's part of the world. So my focus is usually on what's agreed and what's allowed. And that's something that should be in the contract. It should be clear that the venue has 200 box seats that does not go into the manifest, and everyone knows it, and that's part of the agreement.
Right, and also you run across these things in the PACs, the Performing Arts Centers. You've got your season ticket holders that are buying their, tickets to Shenandoah and all the other shows that come in, but they have a right of first refusal for those particular seats in every show that comes into the venue. So your agent's got to be on their game to understand what those season ticket holders are entitled to and how it will affect the manifest. And a lot of times, something you also need to be aware of, and we're going to do an in-depth ticketing panel moving, at another time, because it's a whole environment unto itself. But it's important to have an understanding that the 3rd and 4th rows in a venue might be held for your season ticket holders, and those season ticket holders may not want to come to a Tool show. So rows 3 and 4, while they are held off of available to sell to your clients, they've got to go to your season ticket holders for right of first refusal. Those people may not show up. The PACs will definitely try to reach out to them and get those season ticket holders to decide if they'd like them, so that you don't have these large gaps. But just that's something to be mindful of for our first timers and our newer folks. We call that the out of the left field surprise party portion of your touring career.
Now,
But we're going to do a ticketing panel, and we're going to talk about all of the, because it is, Matt Schneider's on here with me and with us, and he and I have toured together before. And there was just, I remember a couple of days where I had 42 jobs and I couldn't get my head around the 17 ticket types, and my audit wasn't matching his audit, and my head was going to fly off. So we're definitely going to talk about it in depth moving forward.
I think I will say, if you go into a show and there is an area that was not manifested and it's not on the contract, that is a time that is appropriate to call the agent and just make sure that you're all on the same page. Because that could be an argument that the agent and the promoter talk through. You know, there could be some money there, but at that point, that it's appropriate to call your agent.
While we're just on tickets for a second, it's worth just pointing out one thing that you will see on settlements is kills. And to cover terminology, production kills are a section of the sellable tickets that have been killed at an early stage during the advance process. So that's why it's important that your production advance is accurate. A section of the house that cannot be sold due to a myriad of reasons, normally that your production is taking a section of the house. It might be your front house position, it might be a runway, it might be something that, some element of your production that limits selling tickets in that area of the venue. That is what kills are, and those are unsellable tickets. So if you're in a theater but you have a large front of house footprint where your audio and your lighting or video elements may be, then they have to expand that into areas of the venue that would normally have been sold where your footprint not that large. So that's something you'll see on settlements typically is kills.
Right, and it's also important to note that conversely, while you have killed those seats in your projected thoughts about how your production is going to sit, when you get there, you may find out that you're able to go a little more compact than you thought, and you're able to open up those kills and sell them and increase your gross. And that's something that your production team and yourself are going to discuss on the day. When you show up, you're going to look at it and go, guess what? We got another 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, depends on the size of the venue, to put into the revenue pot. And that's awesome.
Right.
But I think one of the important things, whether it's ticketing or production or anything else along these lines, is to get out of the office and to walk around and to see all this stuff.
Right.
I make a point, and if you've hired 2 forklifts, are there 2 forklifts? If you said you've killed 10 rows for production, like you said, do you need those 10 rows killed? I think it's really important to, I think this has been mentioned earlier, but understand, what are you paying for? What is all of this? And really think about, as we said before, why are we advertising a show that sold out 2 months ago?
Right.
I think actually taking that step beyond is really important.
And Morgan, can you chat a little bit about what happens when you arbitrarily run into a filming or archiving expense that you didn't count on, and what those are?
Yeah, lots of
archiving expenses and origination fees coming at you out of the blue.
Well, this again, hopefully everything's discussed in advance, but what can happen a lot is if you have a tour that maybe has a videographer or a photographer on them, and nobody thinks to ask the promoter if it's okay, and then you go ahead and record it, maybe put it up, sell it later on as a stream or something else, or put it as part of a DVD or something, you can end up in a lot of trouble, because the venues, the stagehands, and some other aspects can often charge fees to do that. So this is why it's really important to discuss in advance with your promoter. A lot of promoters will ask those questions these days, especially if they see somebody with a camera. if there's certain differentiations, if it's just for archival footage, which is you're just recording the show just so that the bands can watch it, so that you can get better in the future, just for your own internal use within the band, usually that's fine, but it does make a big difference. And nowadays it's getting, social media is becoming a sticky, what exactly happens to it on social media is becoming a bit more of an issue, but there you can rack up large fees that way. So if your band does record, it is best to discuss it in advance with the promoter. A lot of bands like to do a apologize later sort of tactic, but that can backfire on you and can cost a lot in the end.
It is important for the tour manager to know that you just cannot show up to any venue and point a camera any place you feel like it without understanding that that could come back on you. You need to have that in your mind. So if you see someone pointing a camera, you can decide to try and play stupid about it and turn your head and go, God, I had no idea they were doing that. But you should know it, and that's going to come back and bite you in the butt at some point. So be educated and be proactive for your artist.
Yeah, for reference, some of those 100%. Historic large arenas and venues, the fees can be north of $50,000.
Right.
So you really don't want to get.
It's important, and it's important to explain. It's important to explain that the reason that happens is because when you are recording something, the unions, the stagehand and the labor unions will look at that as recording for television. If they think it's going to be professionally used, you have a broadcast origination situation, and the union goes time and a half. So, and they're not going to, and those guys that you think are sitting off in the corners kind of minding their business, they're watching you. And if they see you guys rolling around with a de facto film crew, they're going to go to their stewards, and they're going to call foul on it because it affects their pocket. Those guys are never not watching.
Yeah. I mean,
so
even
just know that that's a real thing, and in clubs it may be something different. You may be able to do the big bamboozle and pull a little wool over someone's eyes, but you're not going to be able to do it in PACs or anything higher than that. So
don't assume. I think advancing in advance, you're protecting your artist. You know, like you don't need to try and go around it. These clubs are not stupid anymore. I mean, if you're in there with heavy equipment, they know you're filming something beyond social media, and like you'll get slapped with contracts and agreements and all of these things at settlement. And I've seen it happen, you know, like it's imperative that you advance this stuff. Live Nation primarily does it 100% now. Like if you're doing any type of filming, you have to sign agreements and forms and all these things in advance. And that goes back again to settlement. You're saving yourself time. That's going to be additional paperwork and stuff you're going to have to be dealing with on the out if you just kind of overlook that completely.
Everybody's got a camera guy nowadays. It's so common, you know, to be proactive about it. I put it in my rider. Like I let them know, like, yeah, we're traveling with somebody. And so even if sometimes if I have forgotten to bring it up, I put it in the rider. And so the point will come back up in our conversation as we do the advance. But, you know, going back to the settlement sheet that MJ showed earlier, the very bottom of that was something that's important that we wanted to touch on. There was a line item for cash orders. You know, on the road, it's very common for us to have to use cash for so many reasons, like per diem, paying drivers, just expenses on the road, float. And so how we get that cash on the road comes from settlement. And so we thought it was important, but I wanted 5-1 to talk about cash orders, how you time it, denominations, all that. David?
Thanks, Henry. That's a really good one, especially when we were speaking yesterday and Doug was talking about how a lot of tour managers, when we're out and they need cash and they're actually traveling with cash, how to get it, how they're going to travel with it, with everything. But how we generally do it when we're on the road is you kind of look at each week that you're going to do per diems, and a week out or so, try to advance with the booker or the club person that you're going to need cash. And the greatest way to do it, usually a week out, but I generally like to do it 2 weeks out. And as you're setting up your tour, go ahead and figure out these weeks are going to be the weeks that I'm going to need cash. And the most important thing is the amount of cash that you're going to need, and even more important, the denomination. So if you're paying per diem and you know your per diems are like, let's say, $25 per person, it would be great to have 20s and 5s instead of a promoter just coming to you and say, you needed $5,000 in cash, here's $5,000 in $100 bills. Now you're going to have to go out and break out all those different denominations. So always try to advance the specific denominations that you're going to need, not only for per diem and any other miscellaneous stuff.
Thanks, 5-1. You know, like there's times when I remember, like as a TM, I was carrying a lot of cash at certain times, and it's scary. You know, luckily nowadays a lot of systems are going cashless. But Doug, can you tell me, give me some tips on how to manage my cash and how to move it around from city to city?
It's tricky, especially at the level you're going to be dealing with cash the most. Like you said, it's generally becoming impractical to deal with a lot of cash on bigger arena tours, multi-bus, multi-truck tours. But at the small van, one bus, bus and trailer, bus and truck tour, you'll generally be dealing with cash. And it's a tricky situation to manage. You're on the road all the time. You are constantly on the move. You might be going through airports. You might be on a bus for part of your tour. You might be flying, doing ground transportation. So it's a tricky one to manage for sure. But it's important that you maximize security. It's okay. So you may be in a situation where you're not able to bank cash very frequently. And if you're, a lot of young bands, they might be coming up, but they might be selling a lot of merch and you might be getting a lot of cash coming in. So it's important that you put in place some best practices that limit your exposure to security threats. Generally, for the most part, at mid-sized clubs upwards, backstage security is relatively handy. Small clubs, you might have, especially before doors, you might have zero security. So it's important that you maximize what you can do. Generally, most buses have a safe on board, and if you're touring at an arena level or even a theater level, you may have the luxury of a rolling production case with a built-in safe. But if you don't have that, it's important that you utilize the bus safe, keep your cash, keep the vast majority of your cash in a safe place. It goes without saying, but if the bus has a secured safe in it, use that for the bulk of your cash. When you're transporting it to and from the venue, use a small personal safe. What I like to do personally is use a bike lock in conjunction with a safe so that you can lock your safe onto an immovable object in the venue, whether it's, whatever you can find that means that somebody who happens to be walking past your production office can't just go in and grab some cash, or if you don't have a production office, that's very likely at a smaller level. Don't leave your cash out on the table. You see it time and time again. I'm sure you guys who work local production see it a lot. Don't leave your cash sitting on your desk, because guaranteed your artist is going to come and grab you or somebody's going to come and grab you to deal with an urgent situation while you were counting cash, and you're going to put it down on your desk and you're going to run out your office, and just don't do that. That's really, when we were talking yesterday, that's something we really want to avoid. It's
and receipts for everything, and keep track of it. Receipts for everything.
Yes.
Things that I used to find really helpful when I was dealing with more cash was, and I didn't have anywhere to deposit it, is that I would pay for hotels in cash. It's a really good way to dump money. You just have to a lot of times now you have to make sure that the hotel will take a large payment in cash, because sometimes they won't, but if you prearrange it, they usually will. And make sure that you get the receipt for that on the spot. And I immediately, I have a program on a scanner app on my phone. I immediately scan that, because that is cash when you do your cash settlements, the equivalent. But it's a really good way if there's not a bank branch and you're dealing with lots of cash and you can't deposit it. It is a good way to get rid of large sums of cash. So
it's important to check with your business manager that that's acceptable. They might, you know, for example, merch cash may not be usable as tour.
Yeah.
You may not be able to use that as your tour flow. But yeah, if you clear it with your business manager and you're able to use the cash that you receive to pay on the road expenses, that's a great way to limit the amount that you have on hand at any one given point. That's a great point. And also double check every time you receive cash from a promoter. It might be somebody you've worked with 5 times. Count your cash. You know, we were talking yesterday, and there have been many situations we've received cash and the cash is under or over. So if you've requested 10 grand on your first show of the tour, sit down and count that cash. And Jim was saying one of the best investments he made was a cash counter. Do that. What would take 10 minutes to do normally takes you 30 seconds.
Also, I really find that having dollar wraps in wrapping your cash and having your cash wrapped and organized is super important. It may seem dumb, but having that in the hundreds and knowing what and being able to go through it quick and knowing what's there and having that organized is really good too. Just not throwing, and we all get there, like we're in a rush, we're throwing it in our bag, but if we can keep it organized, right. Yeah. It's going to suit you way better, and also know where everything is and what everything is too.
I think it's important just to know your tour, like what Doug was saying, talk to your business managers, know exactly what you need. Make sure you add it to your checklist, go back to your checklist when you're doing your shop for pre-tour. Office space is a good place. They have fireproof banks, bank bags, and everything you need for receipts and all that good stuff. So as we go into the future, we're starting to see less and less cash needs, but that's always a good starting place. Never weigh it out. You're always going to need cash in some capacity on tour. So.
I also want to mention what Raymond mentioned. Thank you for that in the chat. Keep your personal money separate from tour money. Do not mix. If your management or business management, I personally don't allow tour money to go into my personal bank account. I don't withdraw from my personal bank account. I keep those monies separate. Similarly, if you're on a smaller band and they want you to front the money, why don't you go ahead and buy all of that stuff and we'll pay you back once you get us all the receipts. It's okay to say no to that. You are not expected to front all of that money, which is why we're talking about cash advances. You get that money from other sources, but do not feel that you need to be using your money or your bank account personally for this.
And also, please instruct your runners when you float them out to go and do runs for you. If they get low or if they are running out of funds and they need to do a big purchase, please instruct them in the morning that you don't want them to arbitrarily use their own credit cards or to go into their funds to pay for things for the tour. It's gonna give you an accounting problem later in the day. So watch yourself and make sure that you have that conversation with them, because the intentions are good. They're trying to do their best job for you and be helpful, but it can cause an issue later on, and you definitely don't want to get into that situation.
Yeah, that can bite you in the ass later for sure. Doing some Q&A now. So we've got a good question here from an anonymous attendee. It says, I TM'd a club small theater run with a lot of versus deals recently, and some promoter reps didn't know how to explain their settlement sheets. If I had questions or noticed a discrepancy, they would say, that's the sheet and the sheet can't be wrong. Any advice on how to handle this?
That is not true.
Right, correct.
It can be wrong.
Always go to
leave the show unsettled.
That's
leave the show unsettled until you can get with your promoter and your agent and let them hash it out, and you can settle after the fact. You don't have to settle it on the night. You can leave it, and say we'll get as close as we can, and we'll let the agent and your superior hash this out. You know what I mean?
Let's dispel any motion that you have to sign something right there, like that night. Like as a young TM, yes, it can be. It can be scary if you don't know how to handle that. You go back to what we talked about before, go to your resources and go up the chain, call your booking agent, call management, and but you do not have to settle. If there's a discrepancy, there's nothing that says this has to be cleared out by the time you leave. Like you can settle the show after you leave if there's big problems like that.
And that is the beauty of the digital age. Like
Yeah.
you can do everything by email a day later if you have to. You can, if you notice a mistake, you can go back and email it and say, hey guys,
You
you know,
just don't be intimidated to not sign and just refer back to your agent. I mean, you have to realize that we're doing our due diligence to set all these shows out properly, but they're there to help us and are going to backtrack that settlement as well. That it doesn't stop. Once you settle at the show, it's going through the agency and promoter hands after you to recheck that and make sure that's proper. So always defer to your agent in that type of situation, I would say.
I'd like to go back a little bit for a question that came in about the off audit tickets and about suites and stuff. And I'm doing this to tip my hat to Ina, because the week she came out and taught me a lot of things, she taught me this. And one of the suites was beyond the sight lines of the arena, and they relocated, and reload tickets is something that should be definitely gone into on the ticketing format, but they relocated the tickets from that suite over into real inventory and put them in reloads, which was basically a comp, which we didn't agree with, and we made them pay for it. I think that's something to be noted. And thank you, Ina, for that humongous tip that I've used time and time again in arenas.
Scott Smith had a question. What's the best way to handle per diems when touring Europe with multiple currencies, when you don't have the ability to handle it without physical currency, outside of being able to prearrange with the venue?
That's a good question.
Yeah, Mary Jo, you want to go there?
What is the best way to handle per diem? Sorry, I was answering a
currency.
I think everybody has their preferred way of doing it. You know, I personally will usually do the currency of the country that we're starting in, like the UK, or I'll break it down to like UK and EU. If we're going to some other country that has a different currency, then it's up to the people to exchange it if they want to.
Yeah, that's what I do. I like to.
The beginning.
Yeah, I like to do it as sometimes I'll just do it all at the beginning of the tour if I can in US cash. That way it's up to each person on tour to decide if they want to exchange cash and
how much.
And I've broken it up.
Or they can use their card, which they may be getting a better, if they use their card, they may be getting a better exchange fee rather than changing their per diem over. So I leave it as their choice.
I have actually broken it up. Like if I have half American and half, say, British crew, I've broken it up into their currencies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
I do it different all the time. It depends on
their
the tour and logistics, and and how many. If I need cash for something else, and whatever the simplest thing is, I usually do it and just accept it.
Typically, you're going to be spending most of your time in the Eurozone or the United Kingdom. So we just finished a tour where we were in 10 different currency zones, but we were in the UK, I think, for 5 or 6 days, in Eurozone for 19 days. And then almost all of those other countries, you're only there for a day. So Swedish kroner for a day, Norwegian kroner for a day, Danish kroner. You can't, I mean, for me, you can't really get into doing that as per diem. So what we did is we did it GBP and Euro. And then we did, because it was a non-catered tour, we did the buyout, comes from the promoter in the local currency. So people can still eat on the day, and then you give them their per diem in euros or British pounds, and people are generally pretty happy with it. I think it's important.
I would generally do it too, Doug. I would do the same thing.
Yeah. Just check with your team, make sure that, you know, each artist is different. Some people don't want to receive cash at all. I think check in with your team, suggest what makes the most sense to you, and then make sure that everyone's happy with that. That's generally how I would roll with that.
And these days also, it's important to note that there are some business management teams that don't want cash per diems done anymore. My preference as a tour manager has always been to put the per diems in prior to at the start with the last week's pay. We're pay behind per diem advance, so people get it in advance. It should be non-taxable. If it comes into your bank account when you're traveling abroad, you know, then you've got your US currency. It's in your account. If you want to pull some local currency cash out of your ATM, that works. But again, you have to also be aware of what your business management's preference is, because sometimes the call may not be yours, it may be somebody else's. And you're going to have to inform your crew and make sure that they're okay, because people love to get the cash on the road. And that sometimes, if you're not doing it that way, particularly if you have a business management situation that wants to pay per diem at the end of the week as opposed to ahead or in advance of the day is done. So it's important to understand what your business management wants and then to communicate with your crew about how that's going to be paid.
100%.
I don't want to get too much into taxes because I'm obviously not a tax accountant, but somebody just asked about band paying PDs and included it in the 1099. This is for our US friends. That is actually correct now. I'm just going to leave it at that.
Yeah, there was a question as well about WA and CWA. Again, your tax is not, it's a complicated issue, and bands have business managers for a reason. It's their job to be getting out in front of tax issues for touring, but it's important to get with them in advance of a tour and make sure that you have the documentation you need. Yeah. In the US, it's relatively simple as US artists. Sorry, let me rescind what I just said. It's less complicated than going to Europe, for example. If you need, it's important you get with them and you have the correct documentation. A W-9 for US artists, W-8 BENE for international artists. And you're always going to have, certain states in the US will always charge state withholding. These tend to be small, 5%, 7.5%, 2.5% taxes. But as an international artist, you have two options. As a non-US artist touring in the US, you will be subject to 30% withholding unless you have a CWA, which is a central withholding agreement. That is something that your business manager would apply for in advance of a tour. It's expensive. They're about $1,500, $2,000 to apply for. So if you're going on your first tour to the US in a van, or it's likely not financially viable to apply for one. But if you're on a bigger tour, you're going to want to make sure that your artist has that. Otherwise, every show fee that you receive is going to be subject to 30% withholding plus state tax. So for our international tour managers, if you're going on your first US tour, it's important to get with your business manager in advance to make sure that you have the correct documentation.
Oh yeah. If you don't factor that in, your whole tour budget's out of whack by a huge jump. But Levi Wilcox has a question. There's been a few times where settlement occurred at the beginning of the day because it was a sold out show. Any pros and cons and or reasons to hold off for always doing post show? Probably more pros to do it earlier in the day. Somebody want to cover that?
Nothing changes.
Depends your expenses. I mean, how many variable expenses you have that are going to change. But if nothing's going to change, if it's a house nut or something like that, it would make sense to get it done because you don't have anything else to. If it's based on a sellout show, yeah, of course.
What I would probably do in that situation was do the settlement early, but then maybe meet up during the show just to touch base and make sure that nothing has changed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, do your due diligence to make sure nothing's changed. But if you can get that off your plate and check off that item on your checklist sheet earlier in the day, and that's great. You may have to do that early. If you're doing a runner with your artists at the end of the show, you may have to plan out to do these things. Even if it's not a sold out show, you've got to communicate with your promoter rep on when you can settle. Because once the show comes down, we're on a whole different clock to get out of there and move forward.
Yeah.
Let's see. Any other questions? Anyone see one?
Might be notable to make the point too. If you're doing a 2-nighter or a 3-nighter somewhere, you don't have to. Typically, we're going to settle the show on the last night, but definitely get to a number per night. You know what I mean? Yeah. Agree on the first day's numbers before you get into day 2, because things could just get, they could get away from you.
Yeah,
So just
it's
always
always
make
good
sure.
to keep up and know what's going on too. It's any time.
Right.
There's a question regarding tax in Europe. I don't really want to get into the weeds on this one, but it's on a European tour, you might be going through 10, 12, 15 different territories, and each one has a different tax setup. So that's important to get with your business manager. And some North American artists I work with have separate European tax specialists who just deal with touring in Europe and know all the separate forms, like the A1 in France and Italy are fairly well known. And there's ways that you can offset your tax implications in those countries by offsetting production expenses. Things like accommodation, transport, flights can go against your tax implications in many European countries. I would advise keeping an open dialogue with your business manager. Maybe even if they seem like they don't know a whole lot about that, maybe nudging them towards using a European tax specialist, because it can ultimately save your artist a lot of money. If there's a lot of money on the line, then it's a huge benefit to take it. And it's something that you're not. I'm not sure what I'm trying to say here. I think it's something that is in the business management world, but it certainly helps advance the conversation if you bring it up with them early enough.
Your booking agent and also the promoter can be a really valuable asset there. The promoters know their countries usually. I mean, they do this time and time, and all these different artists. So between the promoter, the booking agent, and then of course business management, there's definitely research.
Especially in Canada, they're going to come to you and say, "Do you have this form taken care of? Do you have it?" Most of the time, the Canadians will ask you ahead of time if you have everything in order for that.
100%. Yeah, I'll just send the routing early on and just have the business manager and the agent together and just be like, run through the documentations and make sure that everything lines up properly. And again, just doing your due diligence to just be on top of that is important.
We've got another question here. This is a great one that I wanted to ask all three of you, because I see a lot of students asking how can they become tour accountants? How can they get into that side of the business? So Jesse B asks, Morgan mentioned earlier how she got started with accounting, which was by experience. So these days, do you recommend certain qualifications or experience background, whether it be education or degrees, to get into tour accounting? Or is any of that not necessary? What do business managers and artist managers look for when hiring a tour accountant?
To be honest, a CPA and some other qualifications, they don't really apply. They look good on a resume. They maybe make a business manager feel a little more comfortable. But to be perfectly honest, I started out with a degree in theater and no business experience whatsoever, and gained it all via experience. And then afterwards, I got a degree in accounting online. And to be honest, not much of what I learned in that accounting program is applicable to settling a rock concert. So, it's important to know Excel. It's important to feel comfortable with the math. It's important to feel comfortable with the details and the record keeping. Along those lines, I do want to take this opportunity to mention that 2 points I just want to mention. Confidentiality is super important. You are dealing with some very sensitive information. So it is really important to keep the information confidential. You can't be leaving your paperwork around or chatting with your friends on the bus about how much money the artist made or lost or whatever, depending on the situation. The other thing is good record keeping, good details, be keeping track of details. And that's not something you necessarily need a degree for, but keeping records. I constantly get asked 6 months later, why was stagehands this much 6 months later after a show? Right. So I keep records of everything. But in terms of programs or education, it's certainly helpful, a lot of the finance and accounting information, and nowadays there is more stuff that is directed specifically towards entertainment or even sports or events. There's sort of tie over there.
Jordan, do you have anything to add on advice on how to be a tour accountant?
Passion for numbers and Excel.
Yeah. Eli?
I was a sound guy and a tour manager before I became a tour accountant. And I think that the business manager that hired me was also interviewing CPA graduates And he liked the fact that I'd been on the road for as long as I had, and I'd done merch and tour, done every gig on the road. And he liked that I had that experience more than the people that had a degree. So I think just getting, being good with what you're doing and working hard, I think that's what got me where I am.
Yeah.
I think we've mentioned learning Excel in every session we've done. So if you've been watching, that's a common thread through everything, and knowing Excel is your key to being a tour manager.
And there are so many free tutorials online for Excel, or if you just hit a roadblock when you're trying to figure out a formula, just Google it and there will be an answer.
Well,
That's how I learned a lot of things.
Reach out to you, Mary Jo, and Eli, and Morgan, and Ina, and Henry, and other people, and Jim. Hey, I'm getting ready to settle the show. Or, hey, would you mind taking a look at my settlement sheet here, because I'm not understanding this. And all of you guys have been super helpful in like, oh, well, here it is. Ba-doo-doo-doo. And then it's like a light bulb goes off. So it's great to have someone that you can network with and bounce things off of, because you guys have been a huge, huge help.
And some people use different formulas more than others. Like I just learned a new formula, a new trick for Excel from Ina that like revolutionized my settlement sheets, like that I never knew. So like, just ask people, or have them look at your sheets and debug stuff, or maybe change a little thing. Say, oh, you could streamline it more here or here.
Yeah. And if you're on tour in a different role and you want to learn more about settlement, as a tour manager, I always welcome anybody that wants to learn more about this, because it's something that you don't really get to see. But if you'd like to know, pop into the office in the afternoon. Maybe I can show you some things. And if it's a good time to do so, maybe I'll have you join me in the settlement office, and then we can just watch us go through it. There's there's a lot to learn in it, but it's something that we only kind of learn by jumping into the fire sometimes. But this has been a really good one. I appreciate everyone's contributions to this. Thank you so much.